Thalindra had lived for 700 years. She had seen empires rise and fall. She had watched mountains crumble into dust. She had witnessed the birth and death of 3 different suns in distant galaxies through her scrying pools. But nothing in her long existence had prepared her for what she was about to do. The Forbidden's archive existed at the heart of the Celestial Tower. No elf had entered this chamber in over 10,000 years. The ancient wards hummed with power so old that even Thalindra could not identify its origin. Runes carved into the obsidian walls pulsed with a sickly green light. The air itself felt wrong here. It tasted like copper and fear. At the center of the chamber stood a single pedestal. Upon it rested a book bound in leather that seemed to breathe. The cover moved slowly up and down, as if something alive slept within its pages. This was the Codex of Unmaking. The Elven High Council had forbidden anyone from reading it. They had sealed it away before the first human had learned to make fire. Thalindra reached out with trembling fingers. She knew the risks. She understood that what she was about to do could end everything. But the void creatures had already consumed 3 star systems. The elven fleet was broken. The dwarven forge worlds had gone silent. Even the ancient dragons had fled into the spaces between dimensions. Someone had to find a weapon powerful enough to stop the invasion. The moment her fingers touched the cover, the book opened on its own. The pages turned rapidly, filling the chamber with a sound like screaming winds. Then everything stopped. A single page glowed before her eyes. Words written in a language that predated the universe itself burned their way into her mind. She read them aloud without meaning to. The words forced themselves from her lips. Each syllable tore at the fabric of existence. The floor beneath her feet cracked. The walls began to bleed a substance that was neither liquid nor light. And then reality itself began to split apart. A massive tear appeared in the center of the chamber. Through it, Thalindra could see things that should not exist. Shapes that hurt to look at. Colors that had no names. Sounds that were visible. The tear grew larger with each passing second. Soon it would consume the entire tower. Then the city. Then the world. Then the universe itself. Thalindra fell to her knees. She had made a terrible mistake. The Codex had not contained a weapon against the void creatures. It had contained instructions for ending all of creation. And she had read them perfectly. The tear expanded outward. It passed through the walls of the tower without destroying them. Instead, it changed them. Stone became music. Music became thought. Thought became nothing. The laws of physics simply stopped working wherever the tear touched. Thalindra tried to cast a sealing spell. Her magic fizzled and died before it could form. She tried again with a different spell. Nothing happened. The tear had broken the fundamental rules that allowed magic to exist. She was powerless against something that she herself had unleashed. The tear reached the outer walls of the tower. It touched the city beyond. Buildings began to unravel like threads pulled from a tapestry. People screamed as their bodies began to exist in multiple dimensions at once. Some simply vanished. Others became frozen in moments that would last forever. The destruction spread with the speed of thought. And then something unexpected happened. A human ship dropped out of hyperspace directly above the tower. It was a small vessel, barely larger than an elven pleasure craft. Its hull was covered in scorch marks and crude repairs. The words, "Last Chance," were painted on its side in what appeared to be dried blood mixed with engine grease. The ship's pilot was a human named Marcus Cole. He was 43 years old. He had gray in his beard and scars on his hands. He had been a soldier, a smuggler, a father, and a failure at various points in his life. Right now, he was just trying to deliver medical supplies to a refugee colony 3 systems away. Marcus stared at the tear in reality spreading across the planet below. His instruments went haywire. Half his screen showed impossible readings. The other half simply shut down entirely. But Marcus had seen stings before. Humans always seem to find themselves in the middle of impossible situations. He activated his communication array. Static filled the channel. Then a voice broke through. It was Thalindra, broadcasting an emergency signal with the last of her power. "This is Archmage Thalindra of the Celestial Tower. I have made a terrible mistake. Reality itself is collapsing. There is no way to stop it. I repeat, there is no way to stop it. Flee if you can. I am sorry." Marcus listened to the message 3 times. Then he did something that no elf would ever consider doing. He pointed his ship directly at the tier and accelerated to full speed. The ship shook violently as it entered the field of broken reality. Alarms screamed. Systems failed one by one. The hull began to twist in ways that metal should not twist. Marcus felt his own body stretching across dimensions. Pain filled every cell of his being, but he did not stop. Humans never stopped. He crashed through the roof of the Celestial Tower. The impact should have killed him. Instead, the tier simply absorbed the energy of the collision and converted it into something else entirely. Marcus stumbled out of the wreckage of his ship and found himself standing before Thalindra. The Elven Archmage stared at him with eyes that had witnessed centuries of history. She could not understand what she was seeing. A human. A simple, short-lived, magically barren human. Standing in the heart of a reality collapse as if he belonged there. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "You need to flee. You cannot stop this." "Nothing can stop this." Marcus looked at the tier. It hurt his eyes. It hurt his brain. It hurt his soul. But he had experienced hurt before. Every human had. Pain was just part of being alive. What exactly happened? He asked. Thalindra explained quickly. The codex, the words, the unmaking of reality itself. She told him that no spell could seal the tier. No force in the universe was powerful enough to reverse what she had done. The fundamental rules of existence were broken. There was nothing to be done except accept the end. Marcus listened carefully. Then he walked toward the tier. "What are you doing?" Thalindra screamed. "You will be unmade. You will cease to exist in any form." Marcus did not respond. He simply kept walking. When he reached the edge of the tier, he stopped and looked at it closely. He could see the words of unmaking still floating within the chaos. They were the source of the destruction. They were the engine that drove the collapse of reality. He reached into the tier with his bare hand. The pain was beyond description. His hand existed and did not exist at the same time. He could feel it becoming nothing and everything simultaneously. But Marcus had learned something long ago that the elves had never understood. Pain was not the end. Pain was just a sensation. It could be endured. It could be pushed through. It could be ignored. He grabbed the floating words of unmaking and pulled. The words resisted. They were concepts, not physical objects. They should have been impossible to touch. But Marcus had never been particularly good at following rules. He pulled harder. His muscles screamed. His bones cracked. His mind began to fragment, but he did not stop pulling. Slowly, impossibly, the words began to move. They were being dragged out of the tier by nothing more than human stubbornness. Thalindra watched in absolute disbelief. This should not have been possible. This violated every law of magic, physics, and dimensional theory. Marcus yanked the words free from the tier and held them in his bleeding hand. They burned against his skin. They tried to unmake him, but he refused to let them. Humans were good at refusing things. They refused to die when they should have died. They refused to give up when all hope was lost. They refused to accept that anything was truly impossible. He crushed the words in his fist. The tier in reality screamed. It was a sound that existed in every dimension at once. The collapse began to reverse. The laws of physics reasserted themselves. The buildings that had unraveled began to reform. The people who had been frozen in broken time started to move again. Reality itself was healing. The tier shrank rapidly. It pulled back toward its origin point in the center of the chamber. Marcus stood in its path, still holding the crushed remains of the words of unmaking. The tear tried to consume him, but he simply planted his feet and refused to move. The last fragment of the tear slammed into his chest and vanished. The chamber fell silent. The Codex of Unmaking crumbled into dust on its pedestal. The ancient wards that had protected the archive for 10,000 years flickered and died. Everything was over. Marcus collapsed to his knees. Blood poured from his nose, his ears, his eyes. His hand had turned black where it had touched the words. He could feel parts of himself missing, pieces of his mind that had been unmade and would never return. But he was alive. Reality was intact. The universe continued to exist. Thalindra rushed to his side. She poured healing magic into his body. It was the strongest magic she had ever channeled. An elven archmage at the height of her power, trying to save the life of a single human. The magic worked. Slowly, his wounds began to close. His breathing steadied. His heart continued to beat. "How?" she asked when she was sure he would survive. "How did you do that?" No being in the universe should have been able to touch those words. No force should have been able to remove them from the tear. What you did was impossible. Marcus looked up at her with tired eyes. He managed a small smile despite the pain. "Impossible is just a word," he said. "And words can be broken." Thalindra helped him to his feet. The tower was still standing. The city was still intact. The universe was still real. All because one human had refused to accept that something could not be done. The Elven High Council would later conduct an investigation. They would study the event for centuries. They would write thousands of scholarly papers attempting to explain what had happened, but they would never truly understand. Humans did not operate according to the same rules as everyone else. They were chaos incarnate. They were impossible made flesh. They were the species that looked at the end of all things and simply said no. Marcus returned to his delivery run 3 days later. He never spoke of what happened in the Celestial Tower. He simply continued living his life, doing small jobs, helping people where he could. The elves built a statue of him in the center of the city he had saved. He never went to see it. Monuments were for dead people, and Marcus Cole was very much alive. Thalindra spent the rest of her long existence studying humanity. She traveled to their worlds. She lived among them. She watched them struggle and fight, and refused to surrender against odds that would have broken any other species. And she finally understood why the ancient texts spoke of humans with such fear and respect. They were not the strongest species. They were not the smartest. They were not the most magical or the most advanced. But they were the most stubborn. They were the most unwilling to accept defeat. They were the ones who would reach into the heart of impossible destruction and simply refuse to let it win. Reality itself could break. The laws of physics could shatter. The words of unmaking could tear the universe apart. But a human would always stand up, look at the end of everything, and say 3 simple words. Not today.